Welcome to the Dave Cast on this Thursday, May 28th, as we continue in the Exodus series. And so let's just jump on right in, and let me remind you where we are in the story. Moses is still in front of that burning bush arguing with God about going back to Egypt. And so far the conversation has kind of gone like this. God tells Moses, take off your shoes, this is holy ground. And then God tells Moses, I have seen the suffering of my people. I've heard their cries, and I'm going to save them. And so far, so good. No argument from Moses at this point. But then God tells Moses, I'm sending you, Moses. I am sending you to Pharaoh to lead my people out of Egypt. And that's when Moses begins to give his excuses. And his first excuse is, who am I to do this job? Which God answers, well, Moses, it's not you, it's not who you are, but it's who I am, and I will be with you. And so Moses kind of says at this point, but who are you? What is your name compared to Pharaoh's name? And here's the thing, I don't think I said this before. In Egypt, the Pharaoh is considered a god. And so he's asking, what is your name? Who should I tell? Which God? By what name? And so God answers, I am who I am. And I will strike Pharaoh and he will let you go. I am, and Pharaoh is soon to be not. And so this brings us on up to chapter 4, verse 1. And that's where we start today. That's where Moses offers yet another excuse. And this one is, what if the Israelites don't believe that you have appeared to me? How are they going to believe this story? And so God gives Moses several signs. First, God asks Moses, what's that in your hand, Moses? And it's his staff. It's a wooden stick, shepherds use to sort of guide and direct sheep. They also, he would have used it kind of as a walking cane to give better stability as he's walking through the desert terrain there, kind of like hiking poles, I guess. And so anyway, he had this wooden stick, and God tells Moses to throw down his staff, his stick, and Moses does, and it hits the ground, and it immediately turns into a snake. And I just got to say right here, if I had been Moses, I would have been out of there. I just don't do snakes. I don't know about you. I don't do snakes. But Moses, though, Moses had 40 years of shepherding under his belt. I mean, he has dealt with snakes before. But the way that he would have dealt with them, would be to take that wooden staff and put it down on the neck of the snake and then pick up the snake by the neck and then take it somewhere, I guess, and throw it away or kill it or whatever. But anyway, he doesn't have his staff then. And then so God instructs him. He says, go and pick it up by the tail. And you don't do that. That's not how you pick up snakes. I mean, the snake's going to bite you. But Moses did it. He went and picked up. And then the snake turned back into his staff. And so then God gives Moses a second sign. He tells Moses to put his hand inside his clothing next to his chest. And so Moses does that, and when he pulls out his hand, it's turned white. It's leprous, kind of skin disease thing. That had to be pretty terrifying, right? And then Moses says, put your hand back in and pull it back out. And when he does that, it's turned back to normal. And then God says, if they don't believe those first two signs, here's a third sign you can do. Take some water from the Nile and then just pour it on the dry ground. And the water that you take from that river will become blood on the ground. And so there's those three signs, and they're not just magic tricks. There's symbolism here that Moses, I think, would have immediately understood. And the first one, when you go back to the snake, the staff becoming a snake, the symbol for Pharaoh in Egypt is that of a snake. I mean, it's on their crown or diadem. And actually putting a picture up here, and you can see this is from Egyptian artifacts, and you can see the snake is the symbol, of what the Egyptian Pharaoh was. And so the point that God is making is pretty clear. I'm with you, and you are going to be able to handle Pharaoh. And so the second sign, the leprous hand, that's not quite as obvious. And I've heard several explanations. One is that people with leprosy would have been social outcast. And so Moses is this person who, was a Hebrew, and then he was raised, in the Egyptian, by the Egyptian princes, and then he ran away. And so he is kind of this outcast. And this was a way of restoring him. And so, that's not a bad interpretation. I'm not sure the origin of it, but I think it's more likely, from what I understand from the history of that time, that there was a tradition, or I guess superstition we'd call it, that leprosy was the punishment for speaking slander. And so God was kind of correcting Moses here, because Moses had stated that the Israelites and their leaders would not believe what God had said. And so Moses is in effect slandering God by speaking these words of doubt. And then the river Nile, the blood's a little bit more obvious too. But in Egypt, the Nile is the source of life for them. And the Egyptians at that time would have even worshipped the Nile River as kind of a god. And so taking the water out and pouring it and it becoming blood symbolizes death. And so, regardless of the interpretation of these three signs, they all would have demonstrated God's power to convince Moses to follow God's call. I mean, those are three pretty, incredible signs. What would have been your response? However, Moses is not convinced. He's not convinced, and he continues to give some excuses. But Moses, at this point in the story, has gotten very polite. And so let me just read it to you from the text here. And notice how polite he's being. And Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." The Lord said to him, Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. All right, so pretty convincing, wouldn't you say? But Moses makes yet another excuse. And again, he's being very polite. He says, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else." Pardon your servant, Lord. Not me. Please send somebody else. And so at this point in the story, God has about had it with Moses. And Scripture says he gets angry at Moses. And he says, "Okay, then what about your brother Aaron? He's a great public speaker, and even now I am sending him to meet you. But take your staff along so you can perform those signs with it." And so then we are to verse 18, and it says that Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Let me return to my people in Egypt to see if any of them are still alive." And Jethro tells him to go and wishes him well. And so that's where we're going to stop with our reading for today, and sort of unpack these verses a little bit so that maybe we can have some practical application to them. This passage reminds me that Moses is a lot like us. As he keeps making these excuses. Has anything like that ever come out of your mouth when you suspect God has been calling you to do something? I've heard people say, I don't know enough about the Bible. I can't possibly, teach VBS. I get nervous when I talk to new people. I can't be a greeter. My work just keeps me too busy. I can't be a part of this in the church. I don't know how to talk to teenagers. I don't know how to talk to old people. I've never been good at praying out loud. I mean, the list can go on and on. And so we see in Moses here, these excuses that sometimes, we can put into modern context of how we make excuses. And I'm reminded of the words of that immortal theologian Pogo, who says, we have met the enemy and he is us. And so Moses standing there on the mountain, arguing with God while God is giving him, reason after reason why God is calling him. And in essence, Moses was kind of implying that God didn't know what he was getting into. God, you just don't know who you're getting into with me. Or God didn't know what he was doing as he was calling Moses. But for every objection that Moses made, God had an answer. Seeing that arguing about Moses and the Israelites' reaction was not getting anywhere, Moses tried to make this other tactic. And he started talking about his own inadequacies. He's a lousy public speaker and, all of this. But the point is this: the next time that you hear an excuse coming out of your mouth when God is calling you to do something, think about Moses. When you allow your own feelings of inadequacy to prevent you from serving God, you're taking on responsibility that God never intended for you to have. Because you see, your ability is not the question. It's your willingness to trust, obey, serve, and follow God. That's what it is. I love the verse in the New Testament, 1 Thessalonians 5:24. And it says this: the one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. The one who calls you is faithful, and he will do it. I've heard it said many times, God doesn't call the equipped. God equips the called. And so as we look around us today, we see that God's children still suffer. Whether from famine or natural disaster or racial prejudice or poverty or violence or something else, the people still suffer. God's children still in need for people, called people, to go to them. And so like Moses, we too are called by God to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves, to speak against injustice and inequality, to speak against the political and economic powers of this world which continue to enslave the poor and the powerless. But like Moses, we do not go alone, but we go in the strength of a God who calls us and sends us. And so that's it for today. I just want to say thank you to the Conyers First folks. Thank you for responding to this survey. I mentioned it on the last Stavecast, and it's gone out by e-news. It's also on the app. And so thank you for responding. And if you haven't responded yet, I'd like to encourage you to do so. We're going to keep it open for several more days here. But, if you've had trouble accessing it, just leave a comment in the comment section of this post, and we'll help you figure it out. And so until Saturday, keep bringing the hope. And as you do so, know that the great I Am goes with you. God bless.